and a better world.
So today's Sunday special featuring Sam Harris, the author of Waking Up and the host of the Waking Up podcast, will begin in just a second. First, I want to remind you that you're going to die. I am just going to tell you right now, it's going to happen. And when that happens, if you don't have life insurance, then you're going to be really sorry. 71% of people say they need life insurance. The answer is 100% of people need life insurance. And only 59% of people have coverage. So at least 12 die. And there are certain weird things that happen in your life where you think, I'll never end up being friends with that guy. And then you and I have ended up becoming pretty friendly, which is really kind of interesting. So Sam Harris, for those who don't know, is not only perhaps the foremost atheist philosopher on planet Earth, he's also the host of the Waking Up podcast. He's a neuroscientist and philosopher. You should check out his podcast. It's just terrific. And all of his books are really worth the read. I disagree with them strenuously, and they're really intelligent and really fun to read. And he's not trying to hide the ball. So, right. Sam, thanks so much for stopping by.
Sure, yeah.
So let's just jump right in with the fact that you and I are now sitting together, because that in and of itself is a weird thing. What has happened in the country that we're now part of this kind of deviant conversation from the mainstream that seems to be growing in audience size?
Well, you and I are both part of this wing of media where we're having long-form conversations on podcasts and on YouTube videos where we're reaching a surprisingly large audience. And because of the format, we're not put in these weird rhetorical boxes where we have to struggle to make the other guy look bad in the 45 seconds remaining, on CNN or wherever it is. And so we really can unpack an argument, and we can search for the possibility of convergence in real time together. And so you might not notice the difference if you're listening to this in any 30-second bit of conversation, but over the course of an hour or 2 hours, you notice that you're hearing a conversation that you're not hearing elsewhere. And so and you and I we don't agree, as you say, about many things, but we're in the same media channel, and we're approaching these conversations in a similar spirit of just being willing to put our thoughts on the line and based on a principle of charity, engage with the best version in our opponent.
I think that's really important, because, as you say, when you're spend your life in cable news, it's always finding the worst version of the argument and then bashing it with a club until it's dead like a baby seal on the ice. But it's really interesting, because the intellectual dark web, which is a coined term by our friend Eric Weinstein, at your podcast, or we're doing a taping your podcast in San Francisco, and that, of course, is a conversation between three people who disagree on a wide variety of topics. What do you think sort of characterizes this? Because it's become really controversial, the term itself. There's been a lot of backlash to even the idea that there is an intellectual dark web. Does it exist? If so, what are the sort of common factors you think that unify the widely disparate viewpoints therein?
Well, I think it's what I just mentioned, the fact that these conversations are happening in the dark with respect to the mainstream media. I don't think most people at the New York Times or on CNN understand how big your audience is or how big Joe Rogan's audience is. My audience is. The numbers would surprise them, and the fact that people are listening with that level of engagement would surprise them. And ideological commitments aside or beliefs aside, we're having conversations that are not really yet on the radar of the mainstream media, and yet we have analogous large audiences. And again, it's a spirit of intellectual honesty and adventure where we're not stuck simply trying to win points. You and I will debate many topics, and I think I'm right, you think you're right, and it will have the character of a debate. But in reality, as hard-hitting as any of those exchanges could ever be, I'm not approaching it the way you approach a formal debate. It's more fun. I mean, you get to turn it over and look under the other side of the rock and look at these viewpoints all the way through. And one of the things that I think has happened that's driven this group of people together is the fact that the hard left has become so ensconced in identity politics. I know that you obviously got into a very well-publicized exchange with Ezra Klein at Vox over this, in which I thought wasn't that fun?
I thought he was deeply intellectually dishonest. Shocker. But I thought it was deeply intellectually dishonest. And then his suggestion that you were saying identity politics is bad is in and of itself a form of identity politics.
Right.
What do you make of this whole identity politics rising tide, and what do you think the backlash to that's going to be? Where is it coming from?
Well, it's coming mostly from the left. It's producing a counter effect on the right, which is white or even white male identity politics. And so it's natural to see that these two sides are amplifying one another. But on the left, it's much more troubling for me because the left is the space traditionally where self-criticism and wondering whether or not you might be wrong is a paramount virtue, right? And so but that has metastasized in this context to a kind of the shattering of epistemology, where on some level there's no such thing as truth, there's just power. Right? We're just responding to differences in power, and all of this is anchored to unchangeable characteristics like skin color and sexual preference, and so it's just you are. I've now often described this as just the most unhappy game of Dungeons and Dragons that ever was invented. You have to negotiate these power differentials based on the victimology, how many victimology points you have in this game, and as a white, privileged, heterosexual, you basically have no points, right? So you're not empowered to have a credible opinion on any of the most important topics of our time, right? You're either just part of the problem with respect to all of these variables, and your mansplaining or your cultural appropriation or your wading in here. And so this is what happened with Ezra Klein. At one point he said, we're two privileged white Jewish guys who shouldn't be talking about race at all, right? Like, this is not something we can weigh in on. And then when I changed the topic to anti-Semitism, it got no better for some reason. But it's a problem because clearly, if we want to get to a post-racial society, if we want to get to a society where human beings can simply be identified as human beings, the end game can't be taking things like race and gender difference and sexual orientation immutably seriously. Right? These can't be just the ineradicable variables that had defined a person's position on important topics for all time. If we get to Mars and we're still worried about skin color, right? In a Martian colony, we've done something wrong. So I think we need to reverse engineer what we think the end state should be, and clearly identity politics is not the game we should be playing.
Agreed. I mean, obviously, it's destroying the capacity to even have these conversations, because there's no way to have a conversation with someone who's spending the entire time assessing whether your point of view is even worth being taken seriously, as opposed to the rational nature of what you're saying. And I think that's one of the factors I think that's unifying those of us who are having these conversations. I think another factor that's unifying all of this is a belief in data. Now, I know that you obviously are a deep believer in data and science. I'm quite fond of data and science myself, although you would argue, obviously, that as a religious person, I'm not fond quite enough of data and science, and we'll get to some of that in a little bit. But it seems to me that one of the downsides of the identity politics is the attempt to paint into a corner science, though science is an outgrowth of a particular culture and is therefore irrelevant to general swaths of people. So in the Ezra Klein interview, for example, when you suggested that group differences in IQ exist, and you weren't even saying that those group differences in IQ are attributable to environment or genetics, you were saying we don't know the answer to that. If I don't want to mischaracterize your view, and he was immediately coming back with, well, you can't say that. I mean, I'm not sure how we're supposed to have conversations when you legitimately can't cite data before you even start having a conversation.
And so, in defense of people who worry about this kind of thing, it's obviously possible for data to be wrong, and the conversation continues even once you have data. But what we should all be anchored to is a good faith, intellectually honest, non-smear merchant approach to analyzing what we think we know and why we think we know it. And those principles of rationality and an empirical engagement with reality simply are not susceptible to an identity or even a political interpretation. And this is why reason is the only thing that scales. If I have a good enough argument based on clear enough evidence, it should persuade you if you are being reasonable, no matter what your background, no matter who your parents were, no matter how you were mistreated or not as a child. If we build a reasonable robot, it should be persuaded by the right arguments and the right data. So rationality is mode of argument where it doesn't depend who you are in order to reach the right answer. This is why prototypically reasonable or reason-based topics are so easily divorced from politics and things like mathematics. Right? Anyone who can argue that mathematics or philosophical logic is just a tool of political ideology and oppression that just knows nothing about those topics. But it is true that virtually every other place that we really care about facts and being right or wrong has that character. It should be true ultimately of journalism. Either Lee Harvey Oswald shot Kennedy or he didn't. Right? It's a fact about a human being holding a gun. Right? And we either get access to the data or we don't. So the fact that so much of our discussion about what's going on in terrestrial reality is based on, or is filtered through the lens of people's political commitments is just highly dysfunctional. It's not something we maintain. We should be cutting through it wherever we can.
So where do you think that the United States is going? Because obviously we've seen, the rise of your audience is enormous. You have a huge audience. I think a lot of folks, you mentioned Joe Rogan has an enormous audience. Jordan Peterson obviously has a very big audience. A lot of these people have a very big audience. Do you think that the rise of these new conversations are you optimistic or are you pessimistic? Do you think that these new conversations are going to turn into a new sort of brand of politics that ends up saving the country, or are you pessimistic and you think that the identity politics machines that are now operating at seemingly full blast on all sides, do you think that those end up winning the day for the moment?
I don't know. Yeah, I really think the future is just a big question mark. Because the present is fundamentally surprising to me. I didn't think we would get Trump. There's almost nothing, and getting Trump, I didn't think we would get the kind of reaction we see to Trump. We could have predicted the reaction on the left, but it amazes me every day that he is as untouchable based on his own missteps, crazy utterances. Just the fact that nothing sticks to him, it surprises me every day. So I don't quite know how we got here. I think I think you and I will be fine, right? I'm very optimistic about our having conversations like this, and this channel and media would be having a durable interest for people. But whether it will affect any real political change in the near term, I don't know. Because I see the left is fully capable of playing what should be a fairly good hand so badly as to amplify white populism and Trumpism for well beyond Trump's next 4 years. I just think there's no mistake so idiotic that the left isn't capable of it at this moment. And I'm, as you point out, or as we'll discover, I'm on the left on virtually every relevant question, except the ones we've been talking about, which is the virtues of identity politics and
So let's talk about your political viewpoint a little bit. So you say you're on the left on a bunch of different issues. Are you more on the left socially, as far as being libertarian? Because I mean, the truth is that you and I probably agree on the government's role in a lot of those particular areas. Probably not on abortion, but on same-sex marriage, for example. I think we probably agree the government should not be involved in these sorts of decisions. But as far as economics, are you also on the left here? Are you more in favor of redistributionism? And on what grounds?
Well, I think the government, I'm a fan of libertarianism up to a point. Right? I think the government should only do what it can do best, right? So that winner.
For me, nothing, but for
yeah. But so then I think the arguments about what markets can do and not do, that's where it all gets hashed out. I think there are things that markets just can't efficiently incentivize that we really, as a society, want to incentivize. If it transfers to a renewable economy, I think waiting around for the market to get that perfectly right, which might only happen if we just run out of oil. I think that's waiting too long, right? So I think it's good. So for instance, the people who, and also we should recognize that the oil industry is already subsidized. So if you got those subsidies out, then there'd be a clearer competition with renewables. But I think it would be rational for the government to quote, pick a winner in that space, not a winner as respect to a specific company, but recognize that there's certain things we want to incentivize. And one of them would be, say, to get off of oil, right? Forget about global warming for a second. just we want clean air, right? So if we wanted to incentivize clean air, the market isn't necessarily the best way to do that, because if you're burning something horrendous in your factory, you can't adequately compensate me for the smoke that blows over the fence.
Right, there are externalities out there.
So I think the externalities in many cases are, I think libertarians ignore them, or they think that far too blunt an instrument would correct them, something like a boycott. So if you're a massive polluter, and I don't like it, I can organize a boycott against you, and in the fullness of time, that's going to do its work. I think that's getting truer and truer, right? I think the power of a boycott now with social media is probably as sharp as it can get, or has ever been. But it's easy to look back 20 years to see just how ineffectual those efforts might have been against big corporations.
I do wonder whether the government interventionism in environmental issues particularly is in fact too blunt an instrument, given that there are technological changes that take place that radically change the nature of many of these industries. So for example, I'm a believer that in the next 20 to 30 years, very few people are actually going to commute to work. I mean, the internet has made it essentially possible for you to work wherever you want. It's made it possible for me to work wherever I want. There's still factories out there, but that's a shrinking percentage of the American workforce. I mean, you're seeing major retailers go out of business specifically because people are sitting home. And it may not be efficient for companies to have all these trucks running on the road as opposed to having various forms of transportation. So it seems like a lot of the time when this is my worry. It seems like a lot of the time when the government tries to intervene on behalf of curbing those externalities, it ends up doing a lot more damage than it would if we would have been able to leave the market in place and the market would come up with solutions that would be better for a broader spectrum of people. With that said, I think that depends on the immediacy of the threat. I think that's really what people are talking about when it comes to, for example, global warming. How immediate is that threat? How immediately do we have to deal with it? And are any of the real solutions that are being put on the table capable of dealing with the level of threat that's being talked about by the IPCC? So I want to talk more about that with you in just a second. First, we have to talk about protecting your data. So with all the recent news about data hacks and breaches, it's hard for me not to worry about my digital privacy. No matter what you do online, your mobile carrier and internet service provider, they track all of it. Every website you visit, all the emails you're sending, it's ridiculous. So that's why I've taken back my privacy. I do use ExpressVPN, and these days I don't use the internet without it. ExpressVPN is the world's leading VPN provider. It lets you securely use the internet without being tracked by anyone. And ExpressVPN keeps my online activity private and anonymous while I browse or email or download or stream. It's great for streaming content. You can even use it to watch the World Cup without a cable subscription if you're into that sort of thing. Their easy-to-use app encrypts all of my internet data and hides my IP address, which protects my connection, which is great for me. ExpressVPN costs less than $7 a month and runs seamlessly in the background on your computer, phone, tablet. Every time you use the internet without it, you're putting yourself at risk. So take back internet privacy today. Find out how you can get 3 months free. Go to expressvpn.com/Ben. That's expressvpn.com/Ben for 3 months free with a 1-year package. It is really easy to set up. Takes legitimately only a couple of minutes, and then you just run it in the background on your computer. You never notice it again, but it's protecting you. Visit expressvpn.com/Ben to learn more. That's expressvpn.com/Ben. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about some of the kind of root issues that I think people want us to get into, which is going to be all the religion versus atheism and rationality and all the deep stuff that is actually more fun to talk about than politics, in my view. And I get the pleasure of talking about it with you here because I don't usually have the pleasure of talking about it on a daily basis when I'm covering politics. So since we get to do this, let's do it. So let's talk about where you think morality comes from. So in the religious view, obviously, there are certain things that I believe are capable of understanding by any sentient human being. So I don't believe that all human beings in the absence of religion are immoral people who go around murdering their neighbors and raping their children. I think and in fact, this is pretty well embedded in even Judaic philosophy, the idea that there is a sort of natural law theology where you, as just a normal person, know not to kill people and know not to steal and know to set up courts of law. This is what they call the seven commandments to Noah. But the idea is that anyone can basically discover these things. And there are universals across culture about you're not supposed to murder your brother. But the biblical reading is that to reach a more sophisticated level of morality that leads to sort of right-based society we see here, you at least need the catalyzing enzyme of a Judeo-Christian religion in order to get here. That would, I think, be the most rationalistic argument on behalf of Judeo-Christian values.
But where is here again?
Here would be a civilization that values individual rights above the values of the collective. That says that people are to be treated, to use the biblical phrase, as made in the image of God, that we should treat individuals as made in the image of God. That does not happen in the absence of a Judeo-Christian value system. That's the religious argument.
Although that is more of a historical argument.
Right. That's what I'm saying. It's a rationalistic argument because the deeply religious argument would be God said so, so do it, right? But that's not the argument that I think is the most compelling because that only works if you believe in God and if you believe in revelation. So that's not the argument that I tend to make because I don't find it intellectually convincing. It's an argument from authority, which of course is not particularly convincing. So I tend to make the historical argument, which is that history brought us to that the reason we are at this point in history is because without that particular catalyzing enzyme, you don't get what you have here, which is why the West and Western civilization crop up in a Judeo-Christian system, but don't crop up in, for example, Islamic countries, and Islam's been around for 1,000 years. So number one, what do you make of that argument? And then I want to get into where you think morality comes from.
Right. Well, a few points. One, I'm not convinced by that historical argument. You can cherry-pick the data either way and come up with a different conclusion. And even if I agreed with it, it wouldn't make the case that we want to be an instance of what's called the kinetic balance, which is even if we granted that our respect for individual rights came from a Judeo-Christian tradition, it doesn't mean that it can only come from there or that it even is best gotten from there. And I would say that it actually hasn't come principally from there. And there are many ways. Like, so, for instance, you could say that Christianity, in particular, was in part responsible for the fall of the Roman Empire. So Christianity undermined the notion that the Roman emperor was a god. You know, it made it harder to recruit true soldiers, and they had to farm it out to mercenaries. And it eroded what you might call traditional Roman values. And then the Western Empire fell, and we ushered in the Dark Ages. And insofar as there was a reboot to civilization at that point, it was largely the result of the learning and the philosophical insight of antiquity being preserved by, of all people, the Muslim world.
Right.
So I think you can have it any way you want looking at history, but it just doesn't get you there in terms of the moral content and in this case, the political or social content coming from the Bible or any other religious text.
So then why here? Meaning, like, why in Judeo-Christian civilization, but not Islamic civilization? Because you mentioned rediscovery of Aristotle and reuse of Aristotle in the 10th and 11th centuries was really beginning, in the Islamic world long before Aquinas really depopularized it in the 13th and 14th century.
Well, one, I think, from my point of view, it's impossible to ignore the influence of Islam. Islam is its own ideology and set of dogmatisms that are inflexible and at odds with the spirit of science and fundamentals. And despite the fact that there was a brief period where there seemed to be some happy convergence between scientific and mathematical insight and Islam, for the most part, Islam has been hostile to real intellectual life, and in a way that Christianity was hostile even when the scientific worldview was struggling to be born in the 16th century and the 15th century. What we have historically is a real war of ideas. Crystallized when Galileo was shown the instruments of torture and put under hot bread by people who refused to look through his telescope. And so that was the genius of religion paired with the emerging genius of science in that room.
Well, to be fair, I mean, Galileo was originally sponsored by the church, and so is Copernicus. But there's no question there's a backlash from the church to this stuff.
Yes, and the backlash makes sense because there is a intellectual progress on questions of how the cosmos is organized or where it came from or how life began. All of these questions are the scientific answers to which are in zero-sum contest with the doctrines found in the books. Now, it's true that there are religious people, and now even the Pope, who have relaxed their adherence to tradition enough to make room for something like evolution, right? But it is still a problem.
Not a super new idea. I mean, right? Aquinas was talking about this in the 13th century and 14th century. The idea that that if it was in science and it was contradicted by the book, then you're misreading the book, right? I mean, that's a pretty old idea.
Yeah, but that is to subvert science rather than the book in Aquinas' case. I mean, Aquinas thought heretics should be put to death, right? His argument for capital punishment for heresy. And Augustine made the same argument. Augustine thought they should be tortured, right? So that those two great lights of the Catholic Church gave us the Inquisition and gave us more than a century.
Well, I think it's also fair to say that they were rather instrumental in the development of modern science. So the Dark Ages, first of all, I think the Dark Ages are a bit of an exaggeration in terms of the Dark Ages themselves saw a massive growth in technology and architecture, for example. I mean, Gothic cathedrals are built during the Dark Ages. But the scientific world is, well, virtually every major university in the Western world was sponsored by the Catholic Church. And I'm not a great Catholic defender, right? But virtually all major universities were sponsored by the Catholic Church, which saw consonance between science and religion as a reason to actually investigate the natural world.
Well, no, I mean, I think that's backwards. I think the reality is there was everything that was good that was done anywhere at any time prior to, pick your year, was done by some religious person. I mean, there was just nobody else to do the job, right? So you could make the argument that, Catholics built every bridge in Europe until the Protestants came around and they built their half of the bridges. I mean, so there was just no one else to do the job. And we're human beings who want to pursue various ends, many of which require breakthroughs in learning. So, engineering got born in a religious context. Physics was, the first physicists were people who were Christians, who were, as is often pointed out, Newton spent half his time worrying about biblical prophecy. Now, I think that was an objective waste of his time. He also spent a lot of his time worrying about astrology, right? So you're trying to
alchemy,
yes, and alchemy, and alchemy, insofar as there was anything to it, apart from sort of kind of the internal myth-making that may be of use to some people, edged into chemistry, right? So there was often a real science at the back of a lot of merely mortal confusion where people were trying to work things out. I would argue very much under the shadow of religious commitments that they need not have had and were not actually serving their ultimate ends. And this for me is true in the moral sphere as well, because this is why the Bible, in my view, can't be the real repository of our moral wisdom in any sense, because when you go to read it, you are forced to ignore certain passages or reinterpret them rather aggressively to conform to what you now in the 21st century have every reason to believe is good or a direction worth going socially. So it is just an inconvenient fact that slavery is endorsed in the Bible. It's explicitly endorsed in the Old Testament, and it's certainly not repudiated in the New, right? And Jesus told slaves to serve their masters and to serve their Christian masters especially well. So there's no place in the Bible where you can get a truly compelling case against slavery, because the creator of the universe clearly expected slavery to be a human institution.
Well, except for abolitionists finding enough inspiration in the Bible to use it as their main text.
But they did that despite what's in the Bible.
Well, I think that is, I mean, I don't want to. This shouldn't sound insulting because it's not meant as an insult. I think that from a religious point of view, that's a simplistic reading of the Bible's role in human affairs, meaning that when any written document is given to any group of people, it has to be given to people in a way that they can understand. It's not that slavery was endorsed by the Bible, it's that slavery is universal among human civilization until modern times.
But it was, no, there were religions that have different points of view on all these questions, right? So it was possible in the 5th century BC to have a take on ethics with respect to something like slavery or the killing of, combatants or non-combatants. That was quite a bit more modern and ethical and civilized than is found in the Bible. So I mean, you might not like some of their other commitments, but take something like Jainism, right? I mean, Jainism, Gandhi got his nonviolence from Jainism. Jainism is just, in truth, a religion of peace, unlike Islam, which is the word peace is a euphemism for the word surrender there, or submission. So it's possible for people 2,500 years ago to wake up one day and even write a book which suggests don't harm anyone or anything, even a cricket.
Right. Well, that's fine. But the question is, how many converts does Jainism have? Meaning that the point of, if you're going to give a book over, let's pretend that you thought that God existed and that you were he. And it was your job to convey to a group of human beings what you think morality should be, understanding that they're going to take that and develop that because we do have this gift of human reason that we use to develop things. And so there's a root text, and then it is developed over time. This is why I think Judaism is particularly kind of unique in this respect, because that's been an ongoing dialectic for literally thousands of years. I mean, there's legitimately, thousands of pages of tractates of just people arguing about these particular issues. You would say that the argument should have started from the point of there was no text for them to argue about, and they should have just argued from sort of a priori reason, maybe.
No, I respect text, but I think the principle of revelation is a problem. But just to back up for a second, I think it's certainly problematic for you as a Jew to argue that the legitimacy or success of religion is best measured by the number of adherents in the year 2018. Right?
No, but the point of Judaism also is that it says in the Bible itself that God is going to make great peoples of all of Abraham's sons, for example. And as Maimonides put it in the Jewish belief, even the growth of Islam and Christianity, which are obviously based on a certain Judaic root. I think Islam less so, because there's an actual rewriting of the Old Testament, and the New Testament not as much. Maimonides suggested that Christianity had basically been brought about as an extension of Judaism, which is the greatest. Christianity is the greatest converting religion in the history of the world.
Right. So, but it seems strange to count at the success in